All right, so hello everyone, thanks very much. Welcome to this final Keynote POLLEN18 plenary. If Twitter is to be believed, many of you are running on even less sleep right now than I am, and that's not very much. So thank you so much both for joining us here in Oslo and for remaining with us over three very full, exciting days. Today we are immensely privileged to be joined by Tania Lee as our keynote speaker. In this crowd, I think it's literally just the case that Tania doesn't need an introduction. So I hope you know it's by way of a compliment that I'm only going to sort of give the briefest Scandinavian style introduction. I'll merely say this. I don't think it's an overstatement that virtually everyone in this room will have read Tania's work at some point, been inspired by it, been provoked by it, ultimately been enriched by it, and we're incredibly lucky not only to have Tania with us today, but also to have the opportunity to continue the discussion afterwards with Bram Büscher, another of our finest minds in the POLLEN network. So with that said, please join me in welcoming both Tania and Bram to this final plenary. Thank you so much.
Okay, so, gosh, that's really bright in my eyes. Good morning, and thank you for attending this session. Thank you to Connor and the other organizers. It's a great privilege to be here. I've really enjoyed the last 2 days trying to get my head around what this field called political ecology is becoming, you know, how it's morphing, who's involved with it, what some of the themes are. And I hope that I can offer something a little bit different and hopefully still useful into the mix today. So reflecting on the plenaries so far, Paige in her opener really shone a bright light on ourselves, our practices as scholars and activists, and the kinds of power that we exercise and the kinds of responsibilities that come with that. Ashish yesterday really emphasized hope, and he outlined not just a vision of how things could be organized differently, so I'm going to have to move because of the light, but also gave us some examples of where this was actually happening. So in his talk, what struck me was that although he referred repeatedly to the idea of systemic change, he didn't really spend much time outlining the system, or the system within which these various brave experiments were actually taking place, how that system operates, and the constraints that it poses. Paul yesterday outlined different kinds of system that might come to be, some big grand models. But again, to me, it left me wondering, well, how do we get there from here? How do we move from the present? So my contribution today will be to examine just one of many kind of configurations of power which constrain and shape the world we actually currently live in order to explore how that power works. And the kind of configuration I'm interested in is one which Nancy Fraser recently called progressive neoliberalism, which I would argue is the main format in which we govern and are governed today. More specifically, June Boras in a recent working paper called attention to what he called the consensus at the middle, or consensus at the center, by which he was referring to the proliferation of NGOs with their multi-stakeholder participation, of donors willing to fund such enterprises, which really have an effect shaping advocacy networks. And June argues that the logic of the project with its countable beneficiaries really leads to a situation in which what he calls class-oriented demands and actions are ruled out ruled impossible in terms of being unfeasible and unfundable, so that demands are dismantled, demobilized and moderated, stripped of what he calls their irreverence and subversiveness. And his concern is that this kind of taming and reorganization leaves space for the right. He's arguing that if big insurgent demands are not being made by the left, then they will be made by someone else, and that this kind of mushy middle of consensus win-win is not serving any of us very well. So it's that kind of what he calls too polite forms of power that I want to examine. So this is my title, Commons, Co-ops and Corporations, Assembling Indonesia's 21st Century Land Reform. So land reform is clearly an intervention into the relations between men and things, the classic term of governing in Foucault's terms. If we think about it, in 20th century Asia, revolutions were fought over land reform, and a great many people died. In China and Vietnam, land reform was a critical component of the total transformation of society and its reconstruction along new lines. In Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, land reforms were also far-reaching. Though they were not violent, they were carried out under American military authority as part of post-war reconstruction, and later as kind of in a Cold War mode, in order to forestall left-wing land reforms. So clearly, in these historical examples, it takes force, or at least the threat of force, to take land from one group of people and to give it to another. And yet somehow, in the 21st century version of land reform, there is to be no revolution. Reform is to work on and through social processes, enroll subjects, set conditions, alter practices, use law as an instrument, and limit the use of limit the use of force. So land reform is, in short, rendered technical, as difficult political problems such as inequality and injustice are replaced by goals like legal certainty, stakeholder consultations, and other similar agendas. So the solution to land problems appears to be technical, non-political, and win-win. So this shift might seem to have made 21st century land reform a boring topic, big yawn. But I suggest we should make no mistake, because 21st century land reform, like its earlier versions, is still an intervention, right? It means messing with people's relations to land, which is always a big deal. It affects landscapes, livelihoods, identities, possible ways of living now and in future, and it does transform relations between men and things in quite fundamental ways. So what then are the objectives to be achieved? In 20th century, land reform was about land to the tiller. Revolutionary claims in China and Vietnam, or whether they were revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, as in Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, the idea was to take land from landlords and give it to tillers, give it to peasants. So there were clearly two parties involved, landlords, peasants, and the state. Actors in the 21st century are far more diverse. So we still get land to the tiller in some cases. I think Brazil's landless peoples movement would be a good example. But in many parts of the world, the question of who is to be the beneficiary of land reform, what it's supposed to accomplish, has become far more heterogeneous. So now land reform is supposed to serve goals such as environmental governance, forest conservation, mitigation of climate change, recognition of ethnic territories, enhancement of markets for land, increases in the GNP. That's to say, many objectives travel under or attach to the label of land reform. And heterogeneous actors and practices are also involved. Different technologies, discourses, forms of knowledge, bureaucratic formations, and so on. So this is the terrain I want to explore in this lecture, and I want to use what I this is the particular assemblage that I'm going to be examining. So I want to use this idea, I'm going to come back to this, but an idea of assemblage which I outlined about 10 years ago actually in an article, and think of this as a set of practices. What does it take to assemble land reform today in the formats that I'm going to describe? It takes a whole lot of work. So what is the work? Forging alliance between different parties, different constituencies, different agendas is a huge part of it. Rendering technical, making it seem like the problem, a win-win problem we can all work upon together, not something which is going to be unduly contentious, political and difficult. Authorizing interventions with particular bodies of knowledge which support the unlikely components of this assemblage and make it seem feasible and plausible, managing failures and contradictions, somehow holding together something which looks unlikely, anti-politics clearly, and then reassembling because it never really holds and it needs continuous work to hold the elements together. So when I started reading about Indonesia's contemporary land reform, and in fact land reform, the current land reform more broadly, the figures that jumped out at me were not the landlord and the peasant, as was once the case, but these figures. It's full of language of commons, co-ops and corporations. So these now are the main figures which constitute the assemblage, right? The elements which are to be realigned and brought together in this new version of land reform. And it has also what I would call, what I call a constitutive outside, which is an integral part of an assemblage, the things which cannot be admitted inside, because they would jangle too awkwardly or because they would upset the possibility of this looking like a win-win proposition. And in the case of Indonesia, which I'm going to describe in a bit more detail, I gave them all C's, but basically crony corporate cabals. This has to do with recognizing the real character of the state. If one thinks of the state as the main agent that's supposed to be responsible for carrying out land reform, you have to ask, well, what is the character of the state? Or is it really the kind of enterprise or the kind of entity that could do these things? So the actual character of the state as it's linked with corporations and various kinds of crony networks is one element. Capitalist relations also have to be set aside. It's not possible within this kind of land reform assemblage to really recognize the kind of routine dispossession, everyday capitalism of the kind that I described in my book Land's End. And in the case of Indonesia, on this corner here, communists and corpses are an absolutely crucial part of this land reform because Indonesia's experience involved a land-to-the-tiller type of reform, which was going on in the 1960s and was viciously truncated when the army turned on the people and also turned the people against the people, leading to at least 500,000 people massacred, 1 million people jailed, several more million people's civil rights completely stripped. And one of the main issues of contention was land reform. Indonesia at the time had the third largest communist party after China and Soviet Union. It was a legal party, it was electorally popular, and it was pushing for the implementation of a land reform law which had been passed, on which feet were dragging, it was not happening, and the result was this. So for the subsequent 40 years, the whole topic of land reform could not be mentioned in Indonesia. It was always associated with communists, with the bad things, with the danger that had to be suppressed. And so from one point of view, the fact that land reform is being discussed at all today, you'd have to say, is an accomplishment. It's an accomplishment of the activists, many of whom I've known for 20 years, who worked vigorously to try to get land reform back onto the agenda, to get this truncated reform addressed. But they're doing so under conditions which have severely limited, what the assemblage can actually look like. So the main contours of land injustice in Indonesia, just to put it in really stark terms, chronic landlessness and inequality has existed, at least in Java, at least since the 1800s. It's not a new thing. It's never been resolved. It's still unresolved. Second big problem, the state makes a claim to 65% of the national territory, calls it state land, and in the process of doing this renders the customary land rights of estimated 60 to 80 million people chronically insecure, because although they think they have customary rights to their land, it is defined as state forest, and so they can be dispossessed at any point. The third major emergency, in my view, is what I'm calling a reverse land reform. We're currently in an era in which there's a massive expansion of plantation agriculture. I'm myself working on oil palm plantations, currently at 10 million hectares, government and industry looking for 20 to 30 million hectares of this one crop, mainly under corporate plantation form. So what that means, the active front of land shift at the moment is in the reverse. You're taking land from the people and actively giving it to corporations, and that is the main thing which is actually currently going on. As a result, there is conflict, violence, arrest, eviction, injury, and death. So that is the current situation. Into this steps a land reform plan, and what does it propose to do? This is the current plan, which was announced 2 years ago. This is the land reform agenda currently being implemented. 12.5 million hectares of the state-claimed forest are supposed to be named for social forestry. And what that means is extremely uncertain, because basically the State Forest Department does not want to give up 1 inch of territory and is really only interested in land uses which do not cut trees in any way, shape or form. So what that's going to amount to is very doubtful. 4.5 million hectares are supposed to be legalized. This is basically a titling and formalization program. 4.5 million hectares are supposed to be actually taken from the state forest and given to the people. So that would be the first sort of distributive aspect, but it's not from landlords to peasants, it's from state claimed forest to the people. And very importantly, under this current land reform, concessions are not to be rescinded, right? There's going to be the concessions that have been granted are still there, but there will be efforts to resolve conflicts on a case-by-case basis. So already you can see this is a fairly limited venture, and yet people are mobilizing behind it. And what is intriguing to me is to try to figure out, well, how has this unlikely configuration come to be, and what are the elements which make it even not only plausible, but actually the subject of some enthusiasm from a great many people as well. So the 3 figures that figure in this land reform then, the first of all is the first one I want to highlight is the commons. So there's been quite a bit of discussion of commons in this room, and I think a great many people place their hope in the commons, right? Commons as the good thing, right? The format in which we could live in lives which are less severely governed by the constraints of profit, capital, private property, and so on. In this assemblage, commons have been the site of hope of at least 3 separate agendas which have come together. So first of all, the customary commons of indigenous people. The land rights activists have argued for a long time that Indonesia's indigenous people hold their land in common, they have customary commons regimes, and these should be recognized. So they made a major victory in which the Constitutional Court acknowledged that much of the state-claimed forest actually was the territory of customary communities. But in their recognition, they drew a very tight boundary. Basically, that the people who could claim these rights had to meet evolutionary criteria of 19th century anthropology. So they had to have mechanical solidarity, limited division of labor, togetherness and uniformity, no strong leaders, self-sufficiency, low literacy. The ruling also said that such a community would cease to exist when, under the influence of science and technology, people change and are no longer distinct from the general population. So one could say that the idea of the commons or the customary commons has been admitted, but the number of people who could plausibly qualify for this spot are extremely few. They're basically imagining, tribes of hunter-gatherers living very remotely, and that's the kind of the space of recognition which has been made available. Nevertheless, the Indonesians, the indigenous advocacy group, AMAN and its allies, are working very hard to try to constitute the kinds of commons which can be recognized under this provision. So they're busy mapping territories, they have a website where communities can apply, and of course they're foregrounding the approved elements, local names for different types of forest and farmland, rules to prohibit sale of forest products, knowledge of medicinal plants, and in their documentation they occlude all the dissonant ones, such as cash cropping, individual landholding, the presence of migrants, and multiple axes of inequality, gender, generation, aristocratic rank, land ownership, etc. So they're busy trying to, you could say those are the constitutive exclusions of the customary commons, the thing which makes it possible, even though people who would fit this are actually very hard to find. But their efforts have been matched by, and are really in tune by, the commons of conservation and climate change. So their efforts have been heavily funded by transnational donor agencies for whom indigenous communities permanently ensconced on common land align with their objectives for land governance, forest conservation, and climate change. The linking of indigeneity to conservation is of course long-standing in Indonesia as elsewhere. The idea is that if the destruction of forests is equated with the destruction of indigenous people, then by extension, indigenous people saved can save the forest. Globally, the claim that indigenous people and local communities holding secure collective rights can be trusted to conserve forests has very wide currency, and it's been strongly supported by the Washington-based Rights and Resources Institute. They're very active on this. And they've conducted research to put some very large numbers behind it. So this was what I would call an example of kind of authorizing knowledge in this configuration. A summary of their recent research, this is Rights and Resources, boldly announced almost 2.5 billion people, a third of the world's population, depend on community-held land for their livelihoods. They manage over 50% of the world's lands, although they legally own just 10%. So RRI's fix then for this gap is technical. Legal recognition of customary commons is, quote, fundamental to the advancement of global peace, prosperity, and sustainability, and will solve the related crises of inequality and climate change. Hence, it's urgent for, and look at their list, philanthropists, investors, companies, and NGOs to capitalize on the proven and cost-effective climate change strategy, which, quote, protects everyone's right to live in a more just and prosperous and verdant world. Promises of win-win. So obviously this is a problem in the sense that 2.5 billion people is most of the world's agrarian people who've now been assimilated to this category of people who kind of live on and manage a commons, but most of us who work in agrarian contexts in the global south know that that's really a stretch, in terms of how people actually access, manage, use, or want to manage their land. But here it's been drawn into this assemblage in these very sort of strident and hopeful terms. The World Bank is also all over this because for them, RED funding and so on requires, it's a contractual arrangement that's required with an entity that has a legal personality. And so for them, communities with a licensed commons have the right kind of legal personality, which can then be contracted in climate change and other schemes. So that's why they're in there. Briefly, a new commons for land reform beneficiaries. These are people who've been activists in the land reform movement in Indonesia. They've had bitter experience where people who have reclaimed forest land or plantation land, mobilizing en masse for land invasions, promptly divide up the land into individual parcels, and within a few years have either mortgaged or sold it. And so based on this bitter experience, they're saying any land reform beneficiary must be disallowed from having individual land, must be obliged to have land that's held in common, because only then can they be prevented from dispossessing themselves through the routine mechanisms of mortgage and sale. So that's just an example of how under the idea of commons, some really some quite different agendas, quite different histories, quite different sets of actors and forms of knowledge have kind of been brought in to make this seem feasible. Go a bit faster. Co-ops, dearly beloved of Indonesian nationalists who argued that, Indonesian society is intrinsically communitarian, inclined to cooperation, family sentiment. Some interesting historians have worked on this idea and really traced it back to French and German Romantic scholars who were influenced the school of legal scholarship in the Netherlands, in Leiden, where most of the Indonesians who later went on to write the Indonesian constitution were trained. So these are ideas of the kind of the indigenous village, the customary commons, which really root through European Romantic thought, but are now dearly held beliefs about how Indonesian society and its intrinsically communitarian characteristics are to be understood. So the Indonesia passed a village law which now basically argues that co-ops are the thing, co-ops are the main way in which villages should organize their economies, and in a classic neoliberal twist, they should ally with corporations in order to do this. So co-ops are being heavily promoted. Sadly, in Indonesia, although the Dutch started to promote them more than a century ago, they have never worked. Indonesia does not have a strong tradition. It's very different from parts of Latin America, where co-ops really have been popular. They are organized from the bottom up. They've had durability. They have actually worked. In Indonesia, they are always top down. They're imposed by the government, and they have actually never taken off. Briefly, this one, social forestry in the state-claimed forest. This is the way in which the government is trying to deal with the problem that they don't really want to give up control over forest land, but by arguing that if people banded together in co-ops, then their extremely marginal economic activities like honey collecting, non-timber forest products and so on could somehow magically enter global supply chains and become super lucrative. So this is a way in which co-ops are supposed to solve the problem of poverty in the state-claimed forest and given, onus for doing all this work. Corporations I want to focus on a little bit more. In view of the massive presence and continued expansion of corporate concessions, you would expect corporations have to be addressed somewhere in this land reform. But the role that they play is really very, in my view, it's a strange one. One of the land reform documents states that the goal of land reform, quote, is not anti-big business, but to open new opportunities for the people's economy through household or collective businesses and co-ops to reach the Pancasila economy that combines household, collective or co-op, and state-owned and private enterprise. So it's a kind of an additive idea, that corporations can be there alongside all these other forms, and you don't actually have to address the problem of corporate advance. So really, this is a kind of I would say it's kind of a rearguard action, like as corporations are so massively expanding with their concessions, some land is to be set aside for the people through these kinds of mechanisms. But definitely, the promotion of continued investment is the main thing that's going on. So how then do corporations really figure as land reformers? Again, it's the very hard-working Rights and Resource Institute which have really been promoting this. But I would say it's a larger phenomenon that corporations are being informed that governments have failed to govern land correctly. The image that comes from the literature is of unsuspecting corporations that tumble into situations where an irresponsible government has given them a concession, but whoops, it turns out that people are already living there. Therefore, corporations now have to be held to a much higher standard, and they actually have to do the job that governments fail to do in terms of consulting with the people, mapping out who's actually where and doing what, in order to enter the scene on good terms. Rights and Resources have not only laid out kind of handbooks for these kinds of responsible investment and how to do this, but they've also, in their knowledge production mode, started to do things like quantify risk. Like what is the monetary value of the risk that corporations run when they fail to undertake this kind of proactive land reform. One of the main features of this, of course, is that it wishes away the state. It's as if the corporation can just negotiate directly with the people because the government has already proven itself deficient or ineffective. So this is another aspect of this kind of neoliberal governance mechanism. Corporations and conflict resolution is again interesting because land conflict is obviously everywhere in Indonesia, and the land reform group actually quantifies it. Just hear this. In 2017, there were reportedly 659 cases covering 520,491.87 hectares of land, involving 652,738 households. So what this does, like this kind of fake specificity, is it conjures a world in which some concessions are conflict-ridden, while other concessions are not, right? So you can, in a sense, kind of license and legitimate continued corporate expansion because so long as you're not one of these cases of conflict, you're in the clear. And this has entered also NGO rhetoric in Indonesia where they talk about corporations which are, quote, clean and clear, as in contrast to those which are the subject of conflict and contestation. Now, in my view, 10 million hectares of corporate plantation is never clean and clear, right? I mean, that's just a problem from so many points of view. It doesn't matter whether the corporation has or has not tiptoed over the edge of a conservation area or done some other specific thing. This practice of isolating the bad actors from the good actors, I think, is also part of how corporations are being drawn into this land reform because they can always associate with the good guys. The land reform doesn't offend or attack them because they can be sure to be among those which are clean and clear and virtuous. Okay, so what's left out of this? Corporate crony cabals, like the actual way that Indonesian land concessions are granted is through these kinds of cabals. The government officials sit on the boards of plantations and mining corporations have government officials they pay them to be part of coordinating committees which are involved in land release. So the government is not outside the plantation regulating it, but is in fact inside, inside it at every level from the village upwards. So customary leaders, village headmen, everyone is effectively inside the corporation. So you can't really imagine the state as an agent on the outside capable of enforcing the law or regulating land reform because they're actually already inside. Capitalism and class also evaded here, not really, that none of this addresses the issues which were characteristic of the old 20th century land reform, that's to say tendencies of differentiation among the people, land accumulation is really not addressed here. And the communists and corpses, in my view, they are the sort of crucial constitutive outside of this assemblage in several ways. First of all, sorry, got to the right page. Sorry. They explain, their absence explains why there is no mass party in Indonesia representing the rural or the urban poor, why the Communist Party has never been replaced. Right? There's no people's movement, there's no pro-poor party of any kind, rural or urban. It also explains why corporations love to invest in Indonesia because there are no unions. Plantation workers are not organized. Labor is extremely cheap extremely malleable. It also explains why crony corporate cabals can exist and why they can do what they do because they can, right? They can grab land, they can allocate it, they can be involved in all kinds of connivance, basically because no one can stop them. So an underlying threat, an absence of, or the role of impunity, the fact that no one has ever been held accountable for the massacre of 500,000 people, there's been no truth and reconciliation, there's been no truth actually. So all of that remains as the kind of the backdrop, which helps to explain why this contemporary configuration takes the form it does. So although there's a specific Indonesian history to this, I think it's sort of interesting that some of these elements are actually circulating globally. So this kind of, to understand this kind of configuration, on the one hand you have to trace its national specificity, but on the other hand I think if you were to look at land reform in almost any country in the global south, figures like commons, co-ops and corporations are very likely to be really looming large in how this field is being envisaged. So what I've tried to do then in this talk is to analyze an assemblage, an assemblage which looks superficially rather benign, like commons, co-ops, corporations, but beneficial or virtuous corporations are surely better than evil and unaccountable ones. Commons, well, they may not work that well, but nevertheless, what's to hate? It seems to be the kind of assemblage that a great many people could get behind. And yet, I would argue that when seen both in terms of what it enables, but also what it precludes and forecloses, all of the elements which are not addressed in this assemblage, it actually looks like a rather terrifying thing to me. So its constitutive outside is really part of what makes it so strange. Like, how can you have such an assemblage which looks plausible while these elements remain excluded and chronically unaddressed? So what's at stake here, to go back a little bit and to repeat what I drew from June Boras's paper, I think we are in a situation in which the kind of big insurgent demands which used to be associated with a program like land reform, like a radical reconstruction of people's relationship to land, has been shaped, constrained, configured in ways which are, in his words, far too polite, and in that sense respectful, diminished, win-win, and not likely to work, right? This kind of what he calls, consensus at the center leaves such massive problems unaddressed that it cannot actually hold in the long term. But it's still we can't just dismiss it and say, as Foucault said of discursive assemblages, they're not just failed programs for modeling the world, they are part of the world, right? They organize the categories in which we can understand what's going on around us. They form grids for the perception and evaluation of things. So it is still consequential that this is the way, in a massive agrarian society like Indonesia, these relationships are being thought about today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. All right. Is this working? You hear me? All right, good. I saw that Paul's computer nearly fell yesterday, so I'll try to keep it standing here. All right. Thank you so much, Tania. Thank you for your talk. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to Connor and the organizers for this honor, and especially, of course, to Tania for a great paper and a fantastic presentation. Whenever I read your work or hear you speak, I continue to be amazed, by the clarity, the depth, and the persuasiveness of your writing and analysis, and how you're able to present complex ideas, histories, and peoples in a way that makes sense to me and that enables sense-making for all of us, including for those who do not primarily work in Indonesia. You actually note in your paper that you hope that it's good to think with, and I can assure you that it is very stimulating and great to think with. But to make this even more of a challenge for yourself, and this is probably what happens when you become a much more senior scholar, right? You get a little bit bored just analyzing things with general concepts, so she uses only concepts with a C, right? This is absolutely amazing, right? So when I was thinking about my response, I was thinking I should actually respond in kind and come up with questions and comments and discussion points that also start with the letter C. So that took me a couple of weeks. It turned out to be impossible. A real big challenge. The only thing that I could come up with is that after carefully concocting a circumspect critique of your convincing, commanding and clear conceptualizations around the letter C, I had to conclude I'm actually more of a P kind of person. And this is a horrible thing, right? Because Tania can say to us that she helps us see. Well, I'll leave it at that. I'm not helping anybody here. But I do want to, considering that we're at the POLLEN18 conference, use this opportunity to reflect on your great talk by probing and promoting, indeed, 3 Ps. The 3 Ps of power, political ecology, and posterity. So those will be the 3 Ps around which I will sort of structure my comments, and in doing so, as I was instructed by Connor, I will try to not procrastinate and stay within my allotted period. All right, so first, I will start with power. In your paper, you argue that commons, co-ops, and virtuous corporations are actually good things to promote, but that these inevitably, right, work against the counter forces, I think as this picture quite nicely shows, of capitalism, class differentiation, and crony corporate cabals. These are all, as you rightly note, assemblages that need to be analyzed, tracked, historicized, and in so doing, you say, we can better understand how a formation of power takes shape. So I agree, right? In your paper, you did not yet conceptualize power, but here in your talk, you conceptualized power as a form of neoliberalism and a mode of sort of win-win consensus, middle-of-the-road type politics. But I'm actually not yet quite sure how these add up to a formation of power, right? Particularly in relation to your practices of assemblages. So in other words, how does your conceptualization of power influence the equations and dynamics that you analyze? How do they influence what you see? Right? I realize that this question might be slightly unfair, as you clearly cannot include everything in a paper or a presentation, but some absences, at least for me, were notable or perhaps interesting, particularly as we're talking here about land reform. So one relates, and I'll just name 2 examples of the stuff that I was thinking about. One relates to new forms of technology and how these are rapidly changing forms of rule over land and perhaps more generally. So you do very briefly refer to it, but I wonder whether these new technologies are changing the relations between various actors, including the state, NGOs, activists, and crony capitalist corporations, and land in new ways, right? So GIS, and drones, for example, are used both by corporations and activists to struggle over land or against land dispossessions, as I noted in Sumatra doing some fieldwork earlier this year myself. But even more broadly, under the influence of the data gathering platforms, large-scale land transitions and rural land transformations, and there were several sessions about this here at the POLLEN conference, we see that strategies towards land and people are also changing. Right? They do so in different ways, but one way is that they are becoming increasingly focused on promoting or preempting, note the P's, certain development trajectories and enabling or even locking in others. right? So this type of power, following Brian Masumi, moves away from differentiated forms of Foucauldian biopower towards what he calls ontopower, which restructures space and land to enable new forms of rule based on configuring distinctive modes of value creation into and based on expectations about the future, right? And thereby locking in particular development dynamics. So there may be many others or issues that I can't mention because I don't know the context, but I simply want to ask you maybe to elaborate your conceptualization of power. So that brings me to the next P, that of political ecology. The question is simple. How would you characterize the political ecology of the land reform debate and struggles in Indonesia? Again, you point at this in the presentation, but I felt that this could perhaps have been worked out in a little bit more detail, and I wondered that if you would do so, whether this would change your analysis or not. So at the moment, the two C's of conservation and climate change are relatively small elements in your analysis. But, you know, where is non-human nature in the analysis? And what role does it play? So, for example, we know that land conversion from forests to other types of production or use drastically change in the biophysical material characteristics of land, non-human nature, biodiversity, etc. And I wonder whether, or perhaps how, these changes also transform the terrain over struggle over land reform. So one of the things that I saw in Sumatra, for example, was how conservation actors argued that the forest is not just crucial for biodiversity, nature, or how they could be related to commons and co-ops, but of course the question of water. Just one question that I think a lot of us here are grappling with, or a resource. And then with many local, regional climates changing, areas are becoming wetter or drier, and a greater increase of fires and all natural hazards, as we've again seen in Sumatra, of course. Water increasingly seems to become an important enabling or disabling force in how lands are used, transformed, or imagined. So this is just one example in the bigger question, what role non-human nature plays in land reform going forward. And this question actually brings me to a bigger part, or a bigger agenda that I feel perhaps we should be talking about even more, and that is about bringing together sort of critical agrarian studies and political ecology. Right? And I think Tania's work over the years has done a lot to already help bridge this. But for those who are interested, and on a bit of a side note, Dan Brockington and I are have organized a call for papers with the Journal of Peasant Studies to try to collect some papers to try to do exactly this, to further build on your work and others to bridge critical agrarian studies and political ecology. So finally, I want to touch on the P of posterity, or where to go from here. Right, this may not have been one of your prime objectives for writing the paper, but since the theme of this POLLEN conference relates to alternative sustainabilities, different ways of understanding the green economy, it is a question at the heart of contemporary political ecology debates. So what would a transformative land reform politics entail in Indonesia and beyond? You agree that co-ops and commons and even virtuous corporations are noble objectives. So can these be pushed, even in the face of class differentiation, capitalism and crony corporate cabals? Or do these require a fundamental revolution in political economy? Can smaller steps be made? And if so, what might these be? What types of technologies and what political ecologies could enable or disable these steps? And what role does power play in all of this? So these are merely some reflections and questions stimulated by your excellent talk and excellent paper. The paper is certainly, as you note, good to think with and has important lessons for Indonesia and beyond. So I want to thank you for that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Bram, very much. Is this on? Yes. Okay, so conceptualize of power. I thought quite a bit about this in the book that I wrote on powers of exclusion. Like, what kinds of power are actually working in the land sector. And in that book, we came up with 3 types of power, which we thought were at work. One is the kind of force of regulation, attempts to regulate, zone, license certain kinds of land uses. The second was the power of the market, things like the price of land, the price of rent, the price of credit. This is also a power which very much affects people's capacity to access or be excluded from land. And the third one was force, actual brute force. So one of the powers that's alive in most land conflicts in Indonesia is force, and it comes in many forms. Arson, people set fire to plantations that they don't like, people blockade roads. There's also the force of presence, being there. You can't evict all the people all the time. There are various kinds of ways in which forceful power is at play here. And the fourth one is really legitimation. And in some ways this is about legitimation as much as anything. So what are the arguments which are made about why certain kinds of people should have access to land and other people shouldn't, why land should be used in certain ways and not others. And all of these 3 C's in the middle here are, powerful legitimating devices which argue for certain kinds of configurations. So these are, the kinds of powers at work here. And I think what's useful is to understand all, that whole spectrum. People who start looking at land from the point of view of legislation, they think if only they understood the land law or the land tenure regime, they've kind of got it. And that's just the thin end of how the actual powers at work in terms of people's access to land. So that would be, in part, the mapping is everywhere, but it's interesting that how Indonesia has this project to try to put all conflicting data onto one map, and surprise, surprise, it hasn't happened. Because for crony corporate cabals, that would be a disaster, right? They thrive precisely on mystification and on conflicting boundaries, overlapping jurisdictions. So clear information and boundaries would actually disable them. And for that reason, despite the possible technology and the promise, like if only we could get it all on GIS and all pinned down on one map, somehow technology would solve all of these land conflicts. It isn't happening for those reasons. In terms of what would ecology add, I think I'm a bit, I'm very much influenced in this currently by the disaster of the plantations. It seems to me that the ecological, when I've been at presentations, including in the EU Parliament, on debates about the plantations, and the 3 people who presented about ecology all focused on protected areas. It was, so long as a plantation doesn't tiptoe over the edge of a conservation zone, it's okay. And I'm thinking, how can 10 million hectares of monocrop corporate plantation be ecologically okay, right?